This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. It is not intended to cause or induce breach of an existing agency agreement.
Hello? 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 This is the Vancouver
Commercial
Real Estate Podcast.
And we're back at the Vancouver Commercial Real Estate Podcast. I'm Corey Wright, and I'm the only one you're going to get today. I got no Matt, got no Adam, got no Melissa. I even got no Rod, who I tried to convince to show up today, but Rod's so busy with so many showings, he couldn't join me as a co-host today. So you get just me today. On the program today, we have Vance Leschuk, president of Advance Consulting. Advance Consulting is a leader when it comes to property tax appeals out there. And today we're going to unpack a lot about how that process works for commercial landowners. A lot of people may not realize what options you have available to yourself when it comes to your property taxes after getting your assessment. And Vance can dig into kind of what that process looks like and how it can do it. I think one reason why we wanted to have him on the program now is because obviously you hear some economic, challenges out there right now. You're hearing tariff threats. There's kind of political uncertainty up here in Canada with regards to Mr. Trudeau kind of taking a step back. What's that going to look like? We wanted to have him come on today to talk about how this process works, because from a landlord perspective, you might just think your tenants pay you rent, and that's all fine and dandy. And if the property taxes go up, they're going to pay it. I have true triple net leases. I don't care. But as I said, tenants just pay a check to you. What you do with that check, they probably really don't care. And the higher the check is, the harder it is for them to run business. So as the economy may be in a little bit of a standstill right now and potentially maybe trending downwards, depending on how these tariff threats come to reality with our friends to the south there, is, if you can lower your property taxes, that's going to be a savings you can then pass on to your tenants, which hopefully gives them a more viable option for operations. So we advanced the program talking about that today. We've got lots of great things in store. So without further ado, let's get to our interview today with Vance Leschuk, president, Advance Consulting. This podcast is presented by Impact Commercial.
Impact Commercial, John, Alan, the team over there are fantastic. They've all been on the show.
They have, yeah.
Friends of the show.
Great guys.
Wealth of experience. They can help with all your commercial financing needs.
Whether it's owner-occupiers, land development funds, commercial investments, or multifamily, these guys got you covered.
And they recently obtained their CMHC correspondent lender status.
So for all your commercial lending needs, visit them at impactcommercial.ca.
That's impactcommercial.ca.
We're here today with Vance Leschuk, president, Advance Consulting. Vance, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great, Corey. How you doing?
Good. Thanks.
On the Joe Rogan of the Commercial Real Estate Podcast.
You're way too nice. You're obviously one of our 11 listeners, and we appreciate it. Vance, I'm excited to have you on here. We've known each other for a while now. You've actually even done work for us. And today we're going to talk all about like the assessment process of commercial property, how that can potentially be, could we say challenged? Am I using the right word when I say challenged? Or what options may be available to landlords out there that definitely maybe feel like their assessment value and their property tax might be on the higher side. But before we get into that, Lance, can you tell us more about yourself and Advance Consulting?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and thanks again for this opportunity. My name is Vance Leschuk. I have been involved in the property tax consulting world for, over almost 23 years now. And I know what you'd say if you saw me. You say I'm far too young to have that kind of experience. But I started when I was 10 years old.
It's funny you say that. Me too. So it's perfect.
So yeah, generally work for the major companies. Work for Deloitte & Touche, Altus Group, and Ryan. And then a few years ago, I decided to go off on my own, and I started up my own company. And yeah, done quite well. And I love the business. It's always interesting. I would describe it as more of an art than a science.
Okay.
But yeah, I generally love working on behalf of commercial property owners and saving them money, and it's an rewarding and exciting business to be in.
So let's maybe start there, because I think, you find, especially in a market like in Vancouver, you got your big institutional landlords, you've got all that stuff, but there's also a ton of what we'll call private investors or mom and pop investors, which make up a good chunk, if not the majority of the marketplace. A lot of people maybe don't realize what options are available to them. So I'm a landlord. I've got tenants, they're paying triple net costs. And sometimes I think landlords look at the property tax side of things as, it's paid by my tenants. But one thing that we try to echo to landlords, especially when you come into like tougher economic times, is a tenant writes you a check as a landlord for whatever amount, their gross rent, their triple net, their base and everything. And they really don't care what you do with it. But the more that check is, the harder it is for that tenant to operate. And one of the biggest things on the triple net side of things is the property tax side of it. So I'm a landlord. I'm giving a property tax bill and an assessment of my property from the province and the cities I'm in on an annual basis. A lot of times it may seem like it's ticking up quite quickly. It may seem way higher than what I thought. This is where advanced consulting comes in, where landlords and landowners, can reach out to you to maybe discuss potentially their assessment value and their property taxes and what options are available to them. So let's start there. So I'm a landlord. I've got this property tax bill that was way higher than what I thought. What options do I have if I disagree with this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I guess the first thing I would say is it's funny because I often do get phone calls in May, June, July when people get their property tax bills. And that's when they often contact me to challenge it. And unfortunately, you can't really appeal a tax bill. You have to appeal the actual assessment notice. So the assessments in BC come out in January, and an appeal has to be filed by January 31st in order to contest that value. And then you have to go through the process and then hopefully get a refund check down the line. But there's many factors. I do get owners sometimes will say, exactly what you said. They don't want to appeal it. It's up to the tenants. But most sophisticated owners would realize that, property taxes are usually one of the highest fixed expenses on a property. And if you can lower your operating costs and your CAM costs, it'll give you a competitive advantage in trying to seek higher rental rates, either through the renewal process or if you have vacancy and you have to list your space release. A tenant really just cares how much in total they're paying. And if the operating costs are super high, it's definitely going to affect what you can get for a base rent on a property. And in terms of reasons for appealing, it's not always just value. That's another kind of misconception. We're all here, well, I've got value. It's okay. It's close to what I paid for it. There's other things you should look at. A big one is classification.
Okay.
So in BC, there's actually 9 different classes that BC assessment decides where your property fits in. And the classes are always dependent on what is the actual use of the property. It's got nothing to do with zoning, nothing to do with the OCP. It's simply what was the property used for as of October 31st of the previous year. So for the 2025 roll, it would be a snapshot of the property on October 31st, 2024. I'll just quickly run through the different tax classes. There's 9 of them.
Yeah, please do.
The first one is residential, pretty straightforward. Your house or your rental apartment building will be the residential tax rate. Class 2 is utilities, which is usually a very, very high tax rate, and it would relate to railways, pipelines, telecom facilities. The third is what they call supportive housing. And it would be like the SROs you see in the downtown east side, properties that are housing those persons that would otherwise be homeless. Number 4 is major industry. It'd be like sawmills, mines. 5 is light industry. 6 is business other. And this would be what most commercial properties are. It's sort of a catch-all for retail, office space, hotels. It's called a catch-all. It's a class for any property that doesn't belong in any of the other 8 property classes. It would automatically go into business other. And then 7 is managed forest land. Number 8 is recreational, not-for-profit. I'll go into more detail on that one because that's actually a very interesting classification. And then number 9 is farm class. So the process is the province sets the values, and the province decides what class you belong to. By province, I mean BC assessment. But it's up to the individual cities to determine how much they're going to tax each rate. So there can be a pretty wide discrepancy in rates. I did a quick little, just to give an example of what the tax rates are for class 6.
Yeah.
If you had $1 million property in Vancouver, it would be a very small property. Everything's worth way more than that. But just for example, $1 million property in Vancouver, would pay about just over $10,000 in property taxes. If you're in Surrey, you'd pay about $8,200. If you're in Victoria, you'd pay $17,000. So they have a very high tax rate in Victoria. If you're in Kelowna, you'd pay just under $10,000. If you're in Prince George, you'd pay $20,000. If you're up in Fort St. John, you'd pay $23,000 in property taxes. And that would all be for $1 million commercial building. So it can be super wide discrepancy in tax rates. And they're voted in every year. They just decide how much they want to tax each tax class.
So if I'm going to ask, this is the pink elephant in the room here now, is if I'm like Victoria obviously seems really high and Kelowna seems cheaper, is there advocacies for commercial? If I'm a politician and I've got a budget that I got to approve and I want to increase residential property taxes as little as possible because those are the people that vote me in every 4 years.
Yes.
And I just shove more money onto commercial. Is there any governing bodies or advocacies or anything like that that would stop that or campaign against that? Because if I'm a tenant in a building in Victoria and it's valued at $1 million and I'm paying $17,000 in property tax, which let's just say to make all numbers real easy, that it's a 1,700 square foot space, that's $10 a foot I'm paying as a tenant on a per annum basis. That seems outrageously high versus what I might pay in other cities. How does that happen?
I mean, the conception, obviously, is that politicians always say residents vote, business owners don't vote. They don't have the right to vote. And there's sort of a conception that, well, you know what, they're a commercial property owner. The tenants are paying the taxes anyway. They can just charge more for their goods. Like I've heard politicians tell me this, but I've heard senior officials from BC Assessment say that it really doesn't matter because they're gonna just pass it on to someone anyway. In terms of groups that advocate, there's a number of groups that advocate on behalf of business owners. Most of the Chamber of Commerce, there's fair tax coalitions, and there has been some success in reducing the gap between the residential tax rate and the commercial tax rate. It used to be really high. I think in Vancouver, like when I first started, I think Vancouver was almost 6-to-1 ratio of what the residential tax rate was compared to business. Now it's gone down to about 3.5, 3.6, somewhere in that range. So it has gotten better, but there's still a huge gap in how they tax. And it's just sort of like I said, it's a misconception that all these costs just get passed on anyway, and it's not really going to impact anybody. But it's a huge impact, and you see it all over the place in Vancouver. And I mean, the hardness of these small mom and pop businesses that their property tax rates have probably tripled over the past 10, 12 years.
Oh yeah,
and a lot of them are just closing up shop. I mean, you see a lot of vacancy now in these smaller properties. In some cases, landlords are actually having to subsidize the property taxes, or else places just going to be vacant. Especially you got a lot of these properties are going to get developed down the road. Yeah. So it's hard to attract AAA tenants because they likely have demo clauses in there.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
It's either vacant or they just give it to the local coffee shop, and they have to do a gross lease or lower the base rent a lot. But it's a real issue. It's an issue really across BC.
Well, I can sort of, I'll say I'm asking for a friend at this point, but there's a strata lot that I know of in Victoria. It's a retail strata lot. It's 3,247 square feet, and the property taxes are like $36,000. And to me, it's outrageous, and that the negative effect that will have on business owners having to operate within that area, that how can they sustain that long term? And another friend has a building in Nanaimo, and the property taxes have gone from $86,000, call it 4 years ago, to this past year just under $120,000. And those costs, and it's a 21,000 square foot building. So you're talking you're passing on like $3 to your tenants over that time period for lease rates that are like $16. So you're talking like this is 20% of their base rent is now going to property taxes on top of other operational costs and CAM costs for it. It just, at what point in time, or who has to step forward to say like enough's enough, or how do we curb this? Because it's going to get to the point where you are going to have challenges, to your point, where you have vacancies in really good areas. And it's not so much the lease rates, it's just the operating costs that eventually will affect the lease rates, because tenants pay one check that landlords now have to look at getting less on the base rent side to try to make the numbers work, whether it be a subsidy program or just less base rent. But that's how they debt service the building. So if I can't debt service the building, why would I buy it?
It's huge. And it's funny you mentioned strata properties. They actually, a strata property will be actually assessed higher due to the strata nature of the title. So if you had a building, two buildings side by side, one was a non-strata building at 10,000 square feet, and you had a building next to it that was strata titled, and it was 5 different units of 2,000 square feet each. The strata building would actually be valued probably anywhere from 25 to 30% higher than the non-strata building, even though they're essentially the same GLA and floor print, because they're valued based on like direct sales.
Yeah.
And, since they're smaller units and they often sell to end users who will often pay a little bit more than an investor, their values are much, much higher. I've actually had clients that have gone through the hassle of actually removing the strata titles from their property because they're planning on holding on to it for a long time. And when we run the numbers and just the amount of property taxes they would pay if there wasn't strata title, made it worthwhile for them to go through the hassle of removing it and going through the land title process. So they sort of get it on.
Well, I know one thing too that when we talk about with clients just throughout the province is when you look at these markets, and we'll just say Victoria because that's just the one that was on the top of the mind there, is when we talk about like good markets to invest in and stuff like that, because some of these property taxes primarily, and we'll say Victoria with the strata retail stuff, just because that's probably the highest, it definitely has impact on the decision making that people are going to make when they're making these investments. Because if the base rent in the area is 25 to 30, but my property taxes alone are like $10 a foot plus, it's going to be very hard for me to kind of get those lease rates over time to probably move up in the direction that I want, because my operating costs and my property taxes are so high, that's going to affect the ability for these tenants to pay their rent, period. So I know that's one thing now that is more part of our discussions, because it feels like some of these are getting really high, and Victoria is one of them that's on that conversation point. It's frustrating to speak on it, but at what point do Victoria landlords get together and try to advocate as a collective to some degree, because it's going to have a negative effect on the long-term basis of these tenants in these areas, especially in areas, developing areas over there. Like there's like the Hudson district and there's the Harris Green area district and all this stuff that the city's really pushing a lot of development, and a lot of development's coming in. But it's going to be harder and harder for the retail tenants that, add the animation to the street fronts to survive these numbers with these property taxes increasing at the pace they are.
Yeah, and what it really hurts is sort of the local owner, the family that's owned properties, been in the family for years. And they're not really developers. They kind of treat their tenants well. They, often they'll have lease rates that are a little below market because they don't want turnover, and they're kind of, they see their tenants as kind of partners and they want to keep them in there. But, as you said, there's such a push for development. A lot of these sites are valued as land value based on future development potential and not as a going concern. So they get hit on both ways. They get these massive assessments because, in theory, there's unused density there. And then they get hit with that Class 6 tax rate. So they're getting assessed on future residential potential, but getting taxed on that high commercial there. So I think the key is, the lobbying is great, and there's a lot of great groups out there and people that get involved. I think you have to be a squeaky wheel. And you also just have to keep a close eye on your assessment. Yeah. I think it's key to every year look at it, because in BC it's an annual roll. So it's important, whether you do it yourself or, obviously I'd recommend hiring a professional. And I know somebody, if anybody is interested. But I think it's great just to have somebody that knows experience and knows all the different angles. And like you said, it's not always just about value too, on that classification issue. There's some different tenancies who may qualify for a lower tax rate. That I'm really surprised on how many both property owners and actually, frankly, some agents are unaware or don't seem to understand the opportunity to reclassify certain tenants based on their use. There's daycare is a pretty obvious one. Daycare is actually qualified for Class 1 residential.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's kind of what inspired this episode. So we'll go back a little while here, and we owned a strip mall in Mission at the time that I think we had a daycare come in, and I think the strip mall was arguably 11,000 square feet, let's say, was the GLA. The daycare tenant was probably plus or minus 7,000 square feet of that. So call it, 7,500 square feet. And through the appeal process, which we'll talk about how that works in a second here, you actually went through the appeal process for us, got the classification of the property changed because of the tenancy, which ended up saving a substantial amount of property tax, which was then later passed on to the tenants. How does that process work? So let's maybe walk me through the process, how it starts, how you go through it, what you have to do, when do I get my results? What does that process look like for the listeners who may not be aware?
Yeah, great question. So it starts with the assessment notice being issued. So you get your assessment notice in the first week of January. And, if it was my client, I would review not only the value, but I would take a look at what is the actual use of the property, who are the tenants on there, and what was it used for on October 31st. And often I'll look at the value and it'll be fine. But I'll see, oh, you have a daycare in there. And I'll contact the assessor and say, we're okay with the value. We think the value is fair and reasonable, but there's a daycare in there or another potential tenant, if it's a nonprofit or a society group, may partially qualify for what they call Class 8, which is that recreational not-for-profit tax rate, which is usually way lower than the Class 6. And then my approach is I try to deal directly with the assessor and just kind of work it out amicably. The other option is to wait for the review panel. So if you file an appeal, you'll get a date in which you can attend a review panel, and it's a tribunal. The three people that you argue your case. BC Assessment will defend their value, and then the panel will make a decision. That's at the first level of appeal. And frankly, I've been doing this over 20 years, and you could have a really strong case. It's very difficult to get a good decision from a panel. They typically, for commercial appeals, they'll do what they say is confirm the value, which is just keep it unchanged, and then they do that because they know there's another level of appeal, because you can go to the second level of appeal if you have an unsatisfactory result at the first level. But my approach is to try to just work it out directly with the assessor and reach an agreement. And I think on that property you mentioned there, we sent the facts to the assessor. It was pretty straightforward. There's a daycare in there. They were in there as of October 31st, and we got the classification changed. And the beauty about getting a class change is it kind of runs with the property. That lower tax rate will remain in there forever, or until the daycare leaves, which they don't use them. Once the daycare's in there, they're really good long-term tenants. So you actually get annual savings. And then in terms of fees, you really only have to pay my fee for the first year. But you get an annual benefit.
So that's my next question here. So I'm a landowner. I've got this. I've engaged your services here. You do an assessment maybe on my portfolio, and then you come back and say, hey, there's 3 properties in your portfolio. Either I feel we can challenge the assessed value based on other things or there's a class change. And let's say, for example, my property taxes are $80,000 on a building. You go to fight. You get them reduced by $20,000. So now my property taxes moving forward start at $60,000. How do I pay you as a landlord? How do you get paid in the process?
You can pay me whoever you want. I'm very flexible. There's different fee structures. I can work on an hourly rate. I can work on a flat fee, or I can work on what we call a recovery basis. And the recovery is very straightforward. If I save you money, I send you a bill. It's a percentage of the savings, and we'll pre-negotiate what that percentage is. And if it's on a recovery basis, even if I appeal it and I lose, there's no cost to the client. I leave that to the client to decide whatever they're most comfortable with. I don't tend to work for the huge developers. My clients are mainly kind of family-run companies, smaller companies with a decent portfolio, and like 90% of them, they like the recovery option.
Yeah.
They don't want to get a bill unless they save some money. Of course, all the fees are ultimately passed back to the tenant anyway, who also be the ones who benefit.
Yeah.
But I think that's basically recovery basis is sort of the most popular method there.
Now, you talked about how commercial properties or maybe strata properties are more like done on a comparable basis. I think a lot of people that have purchased commercial property, primarily maybe in developing cores or whatever it is, and the assessment value, let's say, is $2.2 million for argument's sake, but I bought the property for $3.5 million, and I bought it for $3.5 million. Maybe I bought it on a cap rate basis or something like that, which is substantially higher. And I'll be the first to say that property assessed values don't really correlate the same in commercial as they may do in residential. With it, anyone that kind of says, well, here's the assessed value, that's what I want to pay for it. You need to talk to a commercial broker to probably get an education on how that doesn't really apply in most cases. But let's say, I buy the property at $3.5 million. It's previously assessed at $2.2 million. There's a high probability I might get a call from an assessor or a letter to fill out. What is that they want to know? And why are they calling me? They obviously saw the transaction go through BC Assessment at 3.5. It was previously assessed at 2.2 in this example. Are they asking me like, why did I pay 3.5? Are they trying to get some knowledge that they can then use to sort of apply to that property, but other properties in the immediate area?
Yeah, no, they're in the fact finding business, and they will any sale that comes through, they generally contact the owner or the broker. What they're looking for is they're trying to see if there's any external factors that might have influenced that price. Was there favorable financing through development? Is there rezoning plans going on or redevelopment? They use a mass market approach. So in BC, you have the right to one of two values. You have the right to be assessed at market value. What would your property sell for? Or you have the right to what they call equitable value, and whatever is lower. And equitable value would be you have the right to be assessed in line with comparable properties. So I would use an example of you have two strip malls. One's across from the other. They're both in similar locations, access. One property, you've got Corey Wright doing the leasing. Got great tenants in there, well managed, well kept after. And the other property, maybe it's an offshore owner, not really looked after. There's a lot of vacancy, weak tenants in there. And the one that's being managed well is actually being assessed higher. That would actually be unfair because both properties should be assessed using the same economic rents and cap rates and vacancy and expense ratio. You shouldn't be penalized because you're managing your property better level than somebody else. So they always have to look at equity. So even if you paid higher than what it's assessed at, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to crank it up to that sale price. They would have to increase everything else in that area or in that zone on the same rates there. But in terms of information, they're like anybody else. They just want to get all the details, and then they factor it into their models when they're doing the next year's valuation. It's funny because if you see a low sale come through, that's when they really want to dig into it. They'll usually just, if it's a high sale, even if they don't have information, they will use it as the comparables. But if it's a low sale, they'll just say, well, they'll almost assume that there must be something funny about the sale.
Non-arm length transaction.
Yeah, exactly. But it's a good question. Actually, often that is a question people ask when I mention or talk to them about appealing. They'll say, we're looking at selling a property in a couple of years. We don't really want to mess with the assessed value. For commercial properties, the assessed value, all it really determines is how much taxes you're going to pay.
Yeah.
I had a site in Richmond last year. It was assessed at $38 million. I got it down to $31 million at the review panel. Actually won that one at the panel. It sold 4 months later for $68 million.
Wow. That's exhibit A of why assessed value has absolutely nothing to do with market value in commercial real estate. I love it when you get those questions and you try to explain it to them, but they're like, well, this is what my assessment says. So it's, that's exhibit A of why it has no correlation to it. And when people are looking to sell their properties, don't even open up that envelope or even go look on BC Assessment's eValue website there because it has nothing to do with the value of what the market will pay for your property because it can be sold in so many different facets.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the values are almost always a year behind anyway. When you look at, they're using a valuation date of July 1st of the previous year. By the time you finish with the assessment process, it's often July of the next year. So.
Now, if I'm a landowner and I get that phone call or that letter in the mail from BC Assessment, do I have to answer them, or can I just be mum on the subject?
Hey, do you know if anybody from BC Assessment is listening in right now? Do you have any tracking?
Well, we got 11 listeners. You're one of 11, so as long as the other 10 don't work in that office, we should be okay.
Okay. No, my advice to anybody who gets this in, well, first of all, about a third of people fill out those forms or answer those questions. About a third of commercial property tax owners, and that's from BC Assessment's own studies. And in the history of BC Assessment, nobody's ever been fined or gone to BC Assessment jail for not complying.
Yeah, okay.
I always recommend working with the assessor. My advice is you work with a professional and make sure you're not sending them information that's going to hurt you.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll ask for information that's not even relevant. Like if you're being assessed, like a lot of property owners, based on future development, and they're asking for rent rolls and financial statements.
Yeah,
that doesn't even come into play in how they're valuing your property. So why would you want to give that information up, especially if you're not in an appeal process?
Yeah.
If you're appealing a property, you are compelled often to give that information in order to move the appeal forward. But if you're outside of an appeal process, I'd be very careful about what you send over, because unfortunately, if they're asking for appraisals and all that, and you did pay a big number for a property, you might find that your assessment gets increased substantially the next year because of that. And then they have all that information in hand. So, my advice is you want to work with them. You just don't want to have to give them irrelevant information. And I highly recommend getting kind of professional advice before you start sending over financial statements and rent rolls and DNA, whatever they ask for.
Yeah, they want your first child sent over as part of the package. I think one thing too that people kind of maybe forget, it's maybe first time commercial purchase and they get the phone call and they're like, oh, government's calling me. A lease is a private contract between two parties, a landlord and a tenant, which isn't public information out there versus like obviously BC Assessment for sales on houses and condos. That's all public information, but the leases themselves are private. So, it would be honestly unfortunate if they if a landowner was pressured into giving that and not knowing differently. So I think your advice of contacting a professional, maybe if you're not sure, such as yourself with regards to this, it's really important because I think not only could it affect your property, but I'm pretty sure at this local street barbecue of all the landlords, it's not going to go over very well if everyone sees a 20% increase because you give up your rent roll.
Exactly, yeah. Sometimes the numbers lie, right? Sometimes there could be other factors in place, and the rent roll is not really showing the true effect of net rent of a property. So,
yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Good point. So Vance, obviously we sort of unpacked a little bit what this is that the landlords can do, the process they kind of go through. Is there anything else out there that we haven't touched base on that landowners should know about if they get their assessments in January and they're like, this is out to lunch? Is there anything else that they should know about or anything else they can do with regards to trying to challenge it or trying to find a better solution in their minds?
I just think it's important to have a look at. And, my role is to review and analyze and provide recommendations. And I had a property yesterday that I did an inspection on, and it had been appealed. I think he told me over the last 7 years it had been appealed 5 years in a row, but not on class. And within 2 minutes of inspecting it, I found a class opportunity and actually got the deal done on the spot with BC Assessment. So I think it's important to have somebody experienced to have a comprehensive look at it and not just focus on values, but focus on all the other aspects of the assessment and try to get creative and lowering the taxes.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that. Totally agree. Yeah. Vance, before we let you go here, we got a 6-pack of lighthearted questions we ask all of our guests. So we get to know you a little bit outside of the work world there. Do you have a few more minutes for us?
Absolutely.
The 6-pack is powered by our good friends over at Red Point Law.
Red Point Law, Corey, Tim, Falco, Scott, and the team. These are great people with a wealth of experience when it comes to commercial closings and private lending. And I just want to say, Corey, not to cut you off, they have a perfect 5-star review on Google.
So for all your commercial legal needs, visit them at redpointlaw.ca with offices in Vancouver and now open in downtown Kelowna. Awesome. First question up, a book recommendation for our listeners. Doesn't have to be real estate related, but it can.
Oh boy. I used to read voraciously. I every New Year's resolution is to read more favorite books. I'm going to give you 3, I think.
Sure.
Into the Wild. Love that book. John, Krakauer, I think. Okay. But that poor kid who goes to Alaska and finds a school bus. Really good movie too. Born to Run. Okay. Christopher McDougall. Love that book. And my 3rd favorite is the book called Eat the Rich by P.J. O'Rourke, who I'm going to tell you this right now. It is the funniest book on global economics you'll ever read.
Okay. I don't think we've had that one. So that would be a good one for listeners to dig into. All right, Vance, when you find the time, what's your favorite vacation spot?
Oh, man. I would pick any beach. Anywhere with water you can swim in. I love swimming in the ocean water. Okay. Jamaica. We've been to Jamaica several times. Mexico. I would say like Jamaica, Ocho Rios, the beaches were just amazing. So that'd probably be number 1 for me.
Okay. Next question up. You're in Ocho Rios and you've had a few too many drinks. You're on the beach dancing away and someone gives you a karaoke mic. What song are you singing?
Butcher Street Fighting Man by Rolling Stones.
That's a good one.
Absolutely butcher it.
That's okay. It's okay. It's the thought that counts. The fact that you're putting in the effort to actually make it work is what really counts, not so much the outcome on it.
I may have had a mic get unplugged on me before during a karaoke. So I can never confirm or deny it.
So looking back at your career now, obviously you've been in the industry for quite some time. What is one piece of advice you'd give your younger self?
It's so funny. I actually started as a real estate broker.
Okay.
Wildly unsuccessful. I tried to just do everything on my own. If I had to do it over again, I would have picked a really seasoned veteran and just sucked it up and made no money and just followed somebody around for a couple of years to learn the trade rather than stumble around on my own. Yeah, just find somebody who's good at what they do, who's open with suggestions and not threatened by your presence, and just work alongside them and learn the real trade. Not, obviously what you learn in school, is good for about a week or so. Then you really have to know how things work.
Great advice. Great advice. What's a quote that you live by?
Oh man, my wife is the queen of quotes.
Okay.
It's an Al Capone quote. You can get farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with just a kind word. Always makes me laugh. I don't live by it, but it always makes me laugh.
It's a good quote. Good quote. If you could do any deal, who would be your dream deal maker? As in like a business person, who would you most love to do a business deal with at some point in time if you could do a deal with anyone you want. And I'll give you an example. Like for me, I would love to probably do a deal like maybe like a guy like Mark Cuban or something like that, where you can just probably walk away from the deal losing, but you're probably going to learn more in that transaction just based on someone like that of his stature and his experience in various industries. Who would be like your dream deal maker?
I've never had any run-ins with him or deals with him, but I would love to do something with Jay Patterson.
Yeah, there you go. Good. Another great example. All right, Vince, last question up, Vance, before we let you go here. Are the Canucks going to make the playoffs this year?
I think they're going to squeak in and then be horrible in the first round, I have to say.
So I'm guessing, are you a Canuck fan then? Because you answered that pretty quick.
It's funny. I could probably recite stats from like the 80s Canucks teams, like going back to Thomas Brodin and the King, Richard Brodeur. I hadn't followed it that much the last couple of years.
Yeah.
My kids never really got into hockey.
Gotcha.
They're more basketball fans, so I'm more of an NBA guy now, unfortunately.
All right, well, let's pick your brain on that real quick. Did the Mavericks make the right move by trading Doncic to the Lakers?
Well, given that the GM I think needs armed security beside him at all times now, I'm gonna say it was a bad move trading one of the top 3 players in the league. Talent to the Lakers of all people. Yeah,
I know. Well, I think it caught everyone off guard with it. I think there was a thing. Speaking of Mark Cuban, I think there was something that someone had played where years ago he made a quote or something that he would divorce his wife before he would trade Doncic. So I guess obviously with the recent sale, I don't know how much percent he sold. A lot of it. We'll call it 75% for argument's sake, or somewhere around there. Maybe he's not really driving the bus like people thought he was with that trade going on. I was reading a thing too as well, and this will be interesting, is I guess between the max contract that the Mavericks could have offered him versus what the max contract the Lakers could offer him, and the difference in taxes between the state of Texas and California, which is the highest tax state. Apparently over a 5-year period, the difference to him was like $117 million between additional taxes paid and less money that he could get per annum based on the max contract the Mavs could offer versus the Lakers. And I'll be the first to say, hey, if you're still going to get a contract, probably, I don't know, $200 or $300 million, what's $117 million at that point? But nevertheless, it's a lot of money. So I was really surprised to read that there.
Corey, as you see, it's come full circle. It's all about the taxes.
There you go. That's why I thought you'd find it interesting if we kind of leave on that note. But Vance, how can our listeners find out more about yourself and what you guys are doing over at Advance Consulting?
Sure, yeah. You can email me, theLesChuck@hotmail.com. Yes, last living guy having a Hotmail account. That shows you how old I am. My phone number is 778-789-5037. And happy to chat. And if anybody needs any advice, I've got some property owners that appeal on their own. I'm still happy to help them out and guide them through the process. And anything at all. Happy to be here.
Amazing. Well, Vance, thanks so much for taking the time to kind of unpack that today for our listeners. We really appreciate it. There you have it, guys. Our interview today with Vance Leschuk, President, Advance Consulting. He is a great guy. I've had the pleasure of knowing him for a while now. Tons of fun. One of those guys you'd also just love to grab a beer with. Like, he's got tons of great stories, tons of energy, very charismatic guy. And as I said on the interview there, we did have the opportunity to work with him on the appeals process side, and he was very successful and really opened up our eyes, I guess, to a lot of things that are available to landowners out there on the commercial side of things. It was great to have him on there. Hopefully a lot of people got a really good insight on there, but having a professional in his capacity, looking at your portfolio or even helping you with your single strata lot, if it's in Victoria, that we found out is one of the highest out there, give him a call. I highly recommend it. As a commercial landlord, you'll be very thankful if they are successful in getting you some property tax reductions. And as he did talk about, there is options for payments that are tied to what they reduced. That way you're not paying them on an hourly basis. So really, really good there. For all of those who want to do commercial real estate, you can reach out to us at William Wright Commercial anytime. You can visit our website, williamwright.ca. You can call our Vancouver office, 604-428-5255. Let us know what you're looking for, and we'll put you in touch with any of the agents and any of the offices throughout the province. Or you can always drop me an email, Corey@williamwright.ca. Always happy to hear from listeners on what they like and what they don't like, as well as some great ideas for some shows. We always love hearing what you guys want to hear, listen to. And we'll do our best to bring those episodes to reality. So thanks so much for listening, guys. We'll be back next week with another great episode. Take care.
Subscribe today.